If you're looking to improve your interview skills and turn your next interview into a job opportunity, then this is the video for you. We've got Chris Dutton, the founder of Maven Analytics, and he's going to be walking you through exactly what hiring managers are looking for, how they're assessing that, and sharing some specific tips and tricks for each type of interview question. It's a great video. It's also pretty quick. You'll get a lot out of this, and hopefully this will help you improve your interview skills and get that job offer that you're looking for. Hope you'll enjoy the video and let us know what you think in the comments.
So what I want to do in this session is really focus on helping you build confidence and be able to really predict what you're going to walk into and be prepared to crush that interview no matter what questions come your way. We're going to talk about how to be mentally prepared, and I'm going to share some tips and frameworks to help you solve even the toughest types of analytics interviews. So for anyone who isn't aware, this is actually the 6th and final course in our new career roadmap learning path. And I'm going to talk through a bunch of the slides that you'll also find in that course. So if you want to dig deeper, we actually go quite a bit more in depth during the course. And we also have pre-recorded mock interviews and stuff as well. So that's a resource for you after this session if you want to dig in a little bit deeper. So let's talk about the interview, right? First things first. You have to remember that this is your time to shine, okay? This is where you're proving to employers that you have the experience, the personality, the technical chops, and the problem-solving skills to succeed on the job. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that, of course, your technical ability matters, but ultimately being in the right mindset is so, so critical. So a couple things I want you to keep in mind as we kick off this session. Number one, when you walk into an interview, be confident, right? If you've made it that far, it means that employers already think that you could be a great fit for the role. So that's really important to keep in mind. Second, try to relax, try to be yourself, and remember that you're trying to come across as someone who people would love to work with. That personality element is so important. So if you walk in and you're so anxious and so nervous that you're not even letting your true personality shine, that could actually be kind of shooting yourself in the foot. Third, this is a really important one that a lot of people don't often think about, is that an interview is not just a one-way test. It's not just an exam. It's a two-way conversation, right? It's about gauging mutual fit. It's like dating, right? Of course, employers are going to be evaluating you and your personality and your skills and problem-solving ability and all that. But at the same time, you are evaluating the employer, you're evaluating the interviewer, you're evaluating the culture, the fit, the role. This is a big decision for you. Most people spend as much time, if not more, than coworkers than they do with their best friends and sometimes even their family. So you need to go into it with that mindset that you are evaluating them just as much as they are evaluating you. Last but not least, this one should go without saying, don't wing it, right? Even for those seemingly simple questions like, tell me about yourself, talk me through your career path, rehearsing those questions, having anecdotes prepared, writing answers down in advance, that's going to help go a long way to make sure that you deliver those responses clearly, concisely, showcase your communication skills, and so you don't end up forgetting, a great anecdote that you wish you could have told on the spot that you just couldn't bring to mind. Of course, you need to brush up on your skills as well, and we'll talk about how to practice solving some of the more technical assessments or case studies as well. We've got some great frameworks that will help you really nail those types of trickier questions or cases. So let's take a minute and kind of put ourselves in the shoes of the interviewer, right, and the employer or the hiring manager. What are they looking for when you start an interview? Cultural fit, right? We talked about, would we enjoy working with this person? We're going to spend a lot of time together. Is this the right interpersonal and cultural fit? Technical skills, of course. Will this person be able to use the tools that are required to succeed in this particular role? We all know that's important. More general quantitative problem-solving skills are important too. Can you show that you can think strategically? You can break down relevant business problems to solve them? And then this one's really important, right? Curiosity and learning ability. Do you show passion for growth, right? Do you have an aptitude for learning? If you over-index here, then it can help kind of cover up or make up for shortfalls on the technical or quantitative side, right? And we've talked about this a lot where, the job description that you get from an employer, think of that like a wish list, right? They're going to put everything they can possibly want to ask for in that job description because they're searching for a unicorn, right? They want someone who's a 10 out of 10 with Excel, SQL, Power BI, Python, SAS, etc. And realistically, that's just not the case with 99.9% of people out there. So if you check some of those boxes, some of those technical skills, and show that aptitude for learning and picking up any new skills that you might need on the job, that's going to position you really, really well for success. Also, business acumen, especially if you're applying for kind of a more specialized role like an analyst job with a healthcare firm or in an HR department or in finance. Do you understand that business or that industry at a high level? Are you familiar with the types of problems that they typically solve in these types of spaces? That's really important as well. Communication, one of the most critical soft skills of all. Can you communicate clearly and effectively? You can be incredibly sharp with the technical skills. You could master every tool on the planet, but if you can't communicate clearly and get that across in the interview, it's really doing you no good. And then finally, this one's less talked about, but so important, is just enthusiasm. Like, are you genuinely excited about the opportunity? And I can't overstate how important this one is. And maybe I'm biased, but when I'm interviewing candidates for roles here at Maven, when someone goes through the interview and it feels like they're just going through the motions, or it feels like this is just one out of the 10 interviews that they have this week, and they don't ask me anything about the company or the culture or the role, and they don't prove to me that they're excited about this specific job at this specific company, that's a huge red flag for me. And that's something that's completely 100% in your control. So please don't lose sight of that. It isn't talked about as much as these other line items on the slide, but it's equally important. So let's break down different types of interview questions that you're likely to see. We like to break it down into three kind of primary categories here. You've got experience and fit. This is like your behavioral interview, right? It's about talking about your work experience, your personality, seeing if you're a good fit for the role and the company culture. That's really the intention for experience and fit. Sometimes you'll have a technical assessment as well. These can take all sorts of forms. Sometimes it's live Q&A, that's pretty common. Sometimes you get a written assessment, a verbal assessment, a whiteboarding exercise, sometimes even a take-home assignment as well. But regardless of the style, the objective here is just to validate that you have the core skills required for the job. And then in some cases, you may also have a case study exercise as well. I'm not sure how common these are these days. I had to go through a market sizing case when I applied for my first data analyst job, and it was quite common back then. Should be prepared for this. Basically, it's designed to test higher level strategic thinking skills and problem solving ability. So less about specific tools and tactics or techniques and more about general problem solving, as well as things like business acumen, creativity, and poise under pressure, because these can be pretty tough. So some examples about experience and fit. We're going to dive into this much deeper, but things like tell me about yourself, walk me through a project. That's one that I love to ask because it really gives the applicant a chance to showcase their passion and talk about a project that they're really proud of or excited about. What's your biggest strength or weakness? How would coworkers describe you? Things like that. Technical could be something like define this acronym, provide an example, sketch a data model, explain this line of code and what it's doing. Might have a take-home assignment or a project. Those are all examples of technical assessments that you might encounter. And then case studies, kind of three big categories of case studies. You've got estimation and market sizing, which we'll talk about in a little bit more depth. Those are the crazy ones that are like, tell me how many red crayons are produced in China, or how many Volkswagens there are in Germany. Like, crazy questions that you would never know the answer, but it's a chance for you to walk through how you would break down a pretty complex question like that and try to arrive at an answer that's logical and defensible. And again, we've got a great framework for tackling those types of case studies. You might also see root cause analyses or more business-focused strategic cases, which tend to be a little bit more common in the management consulting space. So we're not going to spend a ton of time there. Big pro tip here, no two interviews are exactly the same. You might be applying for an analyst or data science or BI role and only have experience in fit questions. You might have a 2-round interview experience. You might have a 10-round experience. You might have multiple technical assessments. You may or may not have cases. So you have to remember that what's critical is to be prepared for anything, but remember that every interviewer or every company is going to have their own style of interviewing. One tip that's really helpful that was super valuable to me when I was applying is to do a little research on the company, and you can often find out some really valuable intel on their hiring and interview strategies. So Glassdoor.com is a really great resource for this. In fact, when I was applying for my first role, that's the resource that I used, and I actually knew that they commonly use market sizing case studies, so I could really dedicate my focus and my prep time there. So let's drill a little bit deeper into each of these categories, starting with experience and fit. So one standard kind of universal truth is that no matter what job you apply for, every interview is going to include questions in this category because they need to understand how well your work experience and your personality fit with the company culture and the requirements of the role. So during this phase or with this type of question, employers are looking for a bunch of stuff, right? Again, are you someone they want to work with? Are you coming across as positive, as authentic, as genuinely excited about this opportunity? Do you have some experience handling pressure or navigating challenging situations that would be valuable in the role? How does your work experience map to the job descriptions? Do you know what you're in for, right? Have you done your research on the company and the role and the culture? Are you confident but also self-aware and humble? And how are your communication skills, right? Can you communicate clearly? Do you have that growth mindset and that aptitude for learning? These are all things that employers and interviewers are going to be trying to tease out with these experience and fit questions. So a couple do's and don'ts here, things that you should do when you're facing these questions. Take time as you're preparing to review the most common questions and have your responses prepared and rehearsed. I highly encourage you to actually write out answers and responses to commit them to memory, either longhand, pen and paper, or on a computer. That's going to position you really well and make you so much more confident when you're answering those same questions in the real deal during the interview. Make sure you're reading the job description closely and take some time to research the company, right? A little bit of research can go a long way. Being able to speak to what their mission is, do their value and cultures align with your own? And then finally, be honest, be authentic, and remember to approach that interview as a two-way dialogue. Things to avoid, right? Don't be unprepared. Don't wing your responses. Preparation is key. Don't answer questions based on what you think the interviewer wants to hear. Be open, be honest. That's going to go a long way, that authenticity. And then finally, pretty common mistake here. It's a big miss when you have nothing to say if the interview asks you if you have any questions. So think about 3 or 4 questions that you'd like to ask. It might be, can you tell me a bit more about, the day-to-day culture at the company? Or how would you measure success in this role in the first 60 days? Anything like that, just to kind of keep the dialogue going and start to gather really valuable intel for yourself to make sure this role is the right fit. And here's some lists of common questions broken down. Won't go through all of these. We cover them again in more depth in the course. But one example of experience and fit questions are these experience-based ones. Walk me through a project you're proud of. What does a typical day look like? What tools and techniques do you use on the job? What do you do outside of work? That's a common one that sometimes throws people off because they're just prepared to talk about their professional life. And as soon as you ask a question like that, they're totally thrown off guard. But I think it's important because it's an opportunity for you to communicate and demonstrate who you are as an actual human being, not just a cog in the wheel or an employee in this role. Then you've got situational questions. These are all the tell me about a time you ... right? You failed, made a mistake, you had to work with a difficult person, time you had to handle pressure. These are pretty common, and these ones can trip you up if you haven't prepared, right? Because when you're on the spot, face to face with the interviewer, it can be really hard to think up, these great anecdotes and these really representative stories to answer these types of questions. So I would highly recommend, looking at this list, picking out, 4 or 5 of these and identifying what are those anecdotes that you can tell, what are those stories that really shine a light on who you are and how you address these types of situations. And then finally, you've got introspective, which can kind of be the trickiest of all, right? Because they're inward looking questions. Tell me about yourself. What's your greatest strength or your greatest weaknesses? What's your leadership style? Why do you want to work here? Things like that. And I want to drill in on one question because I'm anticipating that this will likely come up in the Q&A. It always does, which is how do you answer the what's your greatest weakness question? Take a minute and I want you to drop kind of your notes in the chat. If you've ever gotten that question before, how did you answer it, right? And maybe you haven't gotten that question, but you have some thoughts on how you might address it. Would love to hear what other people say there. I think my stance on that question is it feels like a trap. It feels scary because it's almost like they're trying to get you to admit where you're a failure or where you're weak. And they're going to use that and use it against you. And you have to reframe the question as a way to kind of showcase your humility and your authenticity in a way that actually strengthens your standing as a candidate. And what I don't mean is answering that question with a non-answer, like my greatest weakness is that I care too much, or that I'm too much of a perfectionist and I just, need my analysis to always be right. That's a BS answer. And I don't think that tells you much about the candidate other than, maybe they're not as authentic as they seem. What I would encourage you to do is, everyone's got strengths and weaknesses, right? Talk about one of those weaknesses. Might be, maybe I'm not as strong in SQL as I would like to be, but here's the most important part. You address a real weakness and then talk about the steps that you're taking to close that skills gap or to address that weakness and get stronger. That does a few things, right? It showcases that you're human, that you're authentic and genuine, that you have strong self-awareness and that you can identify your own weaknesses, and that you're also proactive and driven enough to help turn those weaknesses into strengths over time. So that's my take on it. Very curious to hear how other people solve it, but that tends to be one of the questions that scares people the most. Another pro tip here, again, prepare those stories. I like to use the STAR system or variations of that to help organize thoughts. STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. And it's really just a way to frame your response in a consistent and concise way. So if someone said, tell me about a time you failed or made a mistake or had a difficult situation, you could say, sure, well, here was the situation. I was blah, 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 blah. This was the task I faced. This was the action that I took. And this was the outcome or the result. Just a really nice way to communicate answers to any of these types of questions. So a couple pro tips for interview practice here. I keep talking about how important it is to rehearse and to practice. And there's some amazing tools out there that are all free and at your disposal to get better at rehearsing these questions. So number one, LinkedIn has a great tool. I think it's still around. I believe it's still free. It's called Interview Prep. It's in the jobs category. And what you do is answer a question like this one, tell me about yourself. This is Aaron. He was our guinea pig for this one. and you record a response on video. And what it's going to do is provide AI-powered feedback that includes some pretty interesting insights. So like, what's your pace, your words per minute? What's your pitch variation? Are you super monotone like me, or do you have like a good dynamic range that keeps people engaged? Do you use a ton of filler words like things like that? And this can be a really great way just to get an unbiased, objective piece of feedback on how well you might have answered that question. Another one is Google's free interview warm-up tool. I found this about a couple of weeks ago. I played with it. It lets you, again, record responses to common questions for specific roles. Like they have a data analyst prep one. And then it's similar. It gives you AI-generated feedback and insights on your answers. I don't think this one is quite as deep as the LinkedIn tool, but another good way to just get exposure to the types of questions you're likely to see. And then maybe my favorite one right now is just ChatGPT. It's an awesome resource for interview prep, especially if you're really smart and strategic about prompting. So I don't know if you can read the slide here, but as an example, I dropped in a prompt like this. I said, I want you to act as an interview coach to help me prepare for an upcoming interview for a senior BI analyst role at a large healthcare company. Please play the role of an interviewer. You will ask a question. I'll give my response. You'll provide feedback and tips for improvement. Focus on questions that are specific to this type of role and company. Make sure to cover the key skills that hiring managers for this role would be looking for. It says, great, let's start with a common question that tests your technical and industry-specific knowledge. And the first question it came up with was, can you walk me through how you'd approach analyzing healthcare data to identify trends and insights that could improve patient outcomes or operational efficiency? So really great resource. It kind of gets you in that analytical or interview mindset, and awesome way just to understand like what are some of the common questions that you're likely to walk into to help you prepare. So some good resources there. Definitely recommend digging in, especially if you've got an interview on the horizon. All right, next up, let's talk about the technical assessment. Now we're getting into the stuff that really starts to feel scary for most people. I posted about this a couple weeks ago. If anyone wants to hear about my most embarrassing interview experience where I completely crashed and burned, I posted all about it on LinkedIn, I think like maybe 3 weeks ago. And I included this image as well, because a lot of people talk about how it feels unfair to gauge someone's technical chops when they're under the microscope in an interviewing environment. And I actually agree to a large extent, because this is how I feel, right? When I'm alone in my office and I'm coding or analyzing data on my own pace and timeline, I feel like this guy on the left, right? Like I'm a savant, right? It's just all coming so naturally. But then as soon as you ask me the same questions when I'm sitting at an interview table, it's like all the knowledge has just left my head and I feel like an absolute infant. And I think this is common for most people. But the good news is that there are tips and there are tools and there are frameworks that I'm going to share with you right now that can help you get through this and make it feel much less intimidating, almost more like a game or a challenge that you can get excited about. So let's talk about technical assessments in a little bit more detail. So we all know anyone can write a resume that looks incredibly impressive, right? They can use all the right acronyms and buzzwords. But the technical assessment is your chance to prove that you have those skills, that you can back up the resume, right? So with these assessments, employers, again, are looking for that practical understanding of the tools and techniques required for the job. They're looking to see if you can communicate these complex or technical topics clearly and concisely. They want to make sure you're honest about your level of expertise and experience, able to address gaps in your skill set. I want to make sure your level of experience is appropriate for the role, that you're not really over or under qualified. And perhaps most importantly, they're testing how well you can handle pressure and think on your feet. So some do's and don'ts. What you should do with a technical assessment is be honest about your level of expertise. Anything that you write on your resume, be prepared to back it up with a technical assessment as a rule of thumb. That's super important. Number two, take your time. Give yourself a minute to think before responding. No one is going to fault you for taking a moment to collect your thoughts. And sometimes that will save you from blabbing on or jumping into an incorrect answer because you're so nervous that you want to answer immediately. And try to stay calm and composed. You can ask for help if you get stuck. Anything goes. That's not against the rules here. And try to remember that they are testing your ability to think and respond under pressure. So this is all kind of part of the game. It's part of the experience. And keeping that in mind can help position you for success in these types of scenarios. Things that you shouldn't do, right? It's basically the opposite of all that stuff, right? Don't misrepresent your skill set. Don't pad your resume to make it look really strong. Don't say that you're a 10 out of 10 with Python if you're really a 2 or a 3. Try not to bluff or feign confidence when you don't know the answer or you're not certain. And most importantly, try not to get frustrated. Try not to give up if you get stuck. Sometimes these interviews are actually deliberately designed to see how well you can handle unexpected curveballs or roadblocks or failures. I actually had an interview like that once where they gave me a technical assessment and they handed me a laptop with an Excel workbook that was open. And I had to use some pivot tables and formulas to answer a few questions. And the laptop was like missing some keys and the program was really slow. And it was like they put these deliberate roadblocks in place as a test to see if I would get flustered and upset and give up. And because I had done my research and I had prepped and I was ready for this and I had that mindset, I kind of enjoyed the experience because I knew what they were doing. And I knew that if I stayed calm and confident, that it would actually be helping my standing as a candidate. So be aware of that. It's not that common, but you might run into cases like that. So again, try to keep that positive mindset and showcase that as a strength in your interview. So a couple common types of assessments. You can break it down into knowledge-based or hands-on assessments. So knowledge-based, these are typically delivered like Q&A or conversational formats, and they're often covering pretty foundational topics or concepts specific to the role. So if you're doing a role like a BI analyst or a database role that uses a lot of SQL, for instance, you might get a question like, hey, can you explain the difference between an inner and an outer join, right? Or can you describe what a typical ETL process might look like? They want to know, are these acronyms familiar to you? Are these workflows or these techniques familiar to you? And can you communicate and answer them using everyday language, right? That really show that you have command and mastery of these topics. You might also have a hands-on assessment. These can often test more specific skills or techniques. They can take a bunch of forms. They might have a whiteboard exercise in the room, might be a presentation or a code review, might be a take-home project or a practical exercise using the actual tools themselves. Like the example I just shared where I had to use Excel on the spot to answer certain questions. So again, we kind of talked about this, right? Like whiteboard, sketching data models or data relationships, reviewing pre-written SQL or Python code and describing what each line is doing and what the output might look like, or actually, again, using the tools or getting on a laptop to answer questions or work through projects. And then the last topic I want to talk about here are case studies. So again, like I mentioned earlier, the case study is less about testing specific technical skills and more about gauging your ability to think strategically and to break down and solve complex problems. And these often focus on market sizing, root cause analysis, or business strategy. So with a case study, employers are trying to see, do you have strong strategic thinking, deductive reasoning, and problem-solving skills? Can you communicate your thought process out loud? Can you ask thoughtful questions to gather information that you might need? Can you approach cases or problems from multiple perspectives, come up with creative solutions? Again, just like technical assessments, do you show poise and confidence under pressure? And are you comfortable working with numbers, right? Do you have a good intuition for how to use data and information effectively? Bonus points if you actually enjoy the process at the same time. Again, I think that's really about trying to get in that mindset of like, this is not a high pressure exam. This is a fun exercise where you get to solve an interesting question and show off how you think, right? If you can get yourself in that mindset and believe it, you'll be in great shape. So things to do when you're faced with a case study: try to over communicate. And when I say that, I mean sharing your thought process each step of the way. This is how I might break it down. I would start by doing this, then I would look for this information, et cetera, et cetera. Case studies often are two-way dialogues. So part of the expectation is often that you will ask clarifying questions. They may not give you all the information up front. You may need to ask questions to get more pieces of information or data that you need to solve the case. Make sure you stay calm, you go slow, and try to apply a logical framework, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And then this is one of those cases where preparation and practice are huge. This really won't come naturally for most people. I know it didn't for me, but I have some great resources that we cover in the course that I can share with you if you reach out, that help me really wrap my head around the most common types of cases and some really practical tips to help solve them. So study common cases, brush up on basic math if you're not comfortable there. And then again, if you research the company's hiring or interview strategy, you might be able to tease out some insights into what types of cases they tend to ask. Things that you shouldn't do: don't internalize your thought process. Don't rush into the case without first establishing and communicating a clear framework. And then again, don't get frustrated. Don't give up. These things are supposed to be tough. They're supposed to put you under pressure. That's part of the game. So we talked about 3 different types of cases, right? We're going to focus on the first 2, primarily the first one, which is estimating and market sizing. These cases are just about estimating some value based on very limited information. And you got to use a combination of mental math, logical reasoning, and some creative problem-solving skills. So I don't know, some people have heard of these, some people have not, but some common kind of famous market sizing examples, these are actual ones that have been asked in interviews. How much coffee is sold every morning in New York? How many ping pong balls fit inside a jumbo jet? No one knows the answer to that, right? If you knew the answer to that, that would be really weird, right? So like the point is not to say, oh yeah, I'm very familiar with ping pong and aviation, and I happen to know that you can fit 7.2 million ping pong balls inside of a jumbo jet. That is not how you answer that question. And if someone answered that to me, I'd be like, whoa, that's really weird. Let me ask you a different one. You know, how much coffee is sold in New York? The point is about showing how you approach the problem, showing how you break it down into bite-sized, digestible pieces, and arrive at an answer that you can defend and that feels reasonable under the circumstances. It's really not about the number that you end up with at the end of the day. We're going to talk about this more in just a sec. Root cause analysis. This is an interesting one, a little bit less common, but this is where you might get some sort of an open-ended question or conversation where it's really all about asking questions to gather information, to identify the underlying cause of some hypothetical incident or event. So some examples would be, hey, suppose that you're a marketing analyst and yesterday we saw a huge spike in website traffic. How would you start to diagnose what drove that, right? And then as an analyst, it's about asking smart questions like, okay, well, was that a trend over time or was there a very specific change in traffic? How does it compare for desktop versus mobile traffic? Were there certain audience segments that were impacted more than others? that type of analytical strategic thinking is what employers are going to be looking for with this type of a root cause analysis question. And then finally, you've got business strategy. Less common for analyst and data science roles, more common for like management consulting. But typically it's about providing strategic recommendations for certain business scenarios. Things like pricing recommendations, profitability optimization, growth strategy, M&A, product launch, things like that. We're not really going to spend a lot of time there because it's much less common in the data space. So we talked about frameworks that we can apply to solve these very tricky case studies, right? So when we're thinking about a market sizing question specifically, right, the ping pong balls in a jumbo jet example, here's the framework that you can use to solve it. And not just that question, but any type of market sizing framework. You're going to start by clarifying the question. This is where you ask some thoughtful questions to make sure you understand exactly what you're trying to answer, and you're clarifying any piece of information that might impact the answer you come up with. You can ask about how they're defining things, timeframes, units of measurement, things like that. One benefit of doing that is that it gives you valuable information to answer the case accurately. Another benefit is that it buys you some time to start to think about your approach behind the scenes. Once you've clarified the question, then it's about planning your approach kind of outwardly through communication. So you're going to outline and communicate your thought process or what framework you might apply to solving the problem. Pro tip here, you can ask for a piece of paper or a laptop to actually sketch out your approach. That's what I did. I asked for paper and pencil, and I actually drew out a tree diagram to show how I was going to break down the problem. And I'm going to walk you through that exact example next. Once you've sketched out your framework, then you kind of break it down into small bite-sized calculations. And you work on solving them one at a time using logical and defensible assumptions. Tip here, use easy numbers, right? Don't make it harder on yourself than it has to be. Use round numbers, have a few common data points memorized, like global population, maybe the local country population, a reasonable estimate for household income or life expectancy. I've got a cheat sheet in the course that's really helpful that walks through a handful of stats that are really helpful to have memorized, but you don't have to know everything by any means. And then finally, this is like the cherry on top. Once you've broken it down, you've solved the component calculations, you've arrived at an answer, take a minute and actually gut check that answer, right? You know you're not expected to get it right, but if you think about how you might validate that your answer feels realistic, this is going to kind of set you apart and help you go above and beyond. So you can benchmark it against common sense or against benchmarks like population or GDP or things like that, just to make sure you're in a ballpark that makes some sense. And again, I've said this before, the big pro tip here, how well you do on a market sizing case has very little to do with the answer you come up with. And it has everything to do with your ability to demonstrate how you can think critically, communicate clearly, and attack the problem logically. That's what this is all about. All right, let's do an example. Let's talk through a market sizing case study for the global iPhone market. So I want you to close your eyes. Imagine that you're in this interview. Let's call it a BI analyst role for an ad agency, right? Just for example. And the interviewer says, all right, we're going to do a market sizing case. Here's my question for you. How big is the global market for iPhones? Now let's think about our framework, right? Our 4-step framework, and start at the top by clarifying that question. Here's something I might ask, right? I'm assuming we can define market size in terms of total sales in US dollars in a given year, correct? They say, yeah, that's correct. Okay, also assume that we're estimating the market for iPhone devices alone, right? Not the accessory market. Yes, you can ignore the market for iPhone accessories. Okay, and to clarify, we're estimating the current market today, right? We're not assuming a future projection or any future growth. Yes, please estimate the current market size. Okay, great. Goal is to estimate a single value for the total global market size, correct? Yes, no need to break it down. So you may have noticed something about these questions in the way that I'm asking them. I'm asking favorable closed-ended questions for a few reasons. It helps control the dialogue and it helps work to my strengths, right? Notice how I said I'm assuming we're estimating the market for devices, not accessories, right? That way I don't want to have to calculate a separate market for accessories. I want to keep it simple and focus on devices. So by asking that in a closed-ended way, instead of, hey, should I estimate the market for everything, accessories, they might say, yeah, sure, go ahead, which makes the problem much more complicated for myself. So a little subtle tip, but could be really valuable just in the way that you frame these initial questions. And even though some of these might seem obvious, perhaps, by asking them, I've bought myself a few minutes to kind of start turning the gears behind the scenes and think about how I'm going to tackle this question. So step 2 in the framework is about planning the approach. So this is what I might communicate out loud during the interview. Say, okay, I understand the question here. I'm going to take a top-down approach to try to estimate the market size. First, I'm going to use the global population of the entire world, and I'm going to estimate the number or the percent of people who use smartphones. And with those two inputs, I can estimate the number of global smartphone users. From there, once I have that number, I'll come up with an estimate for Apple's share of that smartphone market, and that's going to help me determine the number of global iPhone users. And then finally, if I can understand the iPhone replacement rate, how often people buy iPhones per year, and the retail cost of an iPhone, that's going to give me everything I need to determine the total market size in dollars. Okay, and this is the tree diagram that I referenced earlier that you can actually sketch out on the spot, which can be super helpful. Once you've done this, the third step is to break it down. You're going to solve each of these component pieces left to right. So I might say, okay, let's assume the global population is 8 billion, right? Nice round number. And maybe 3/4 of people use smartphones. I don't know the answer here, but I'm making a logical guess, right? A lot of people use smartphones. By multiplying those numbers, I can estimate there are 6 billion smartphone users in the world. Now, if we assume that globally, Apple's share of the market is 20%, maybe that might be low, that might be high, I'm not sure. But with those numbers, we can figure out that there are 1.2 billion iPhone users out there. And now if we think about how often iPhones are purchased, let's say every 5 years you're buying a new phone, at least for me, that's about my cadence. That means that the replacement rate is 0.2 iPhones per year. You multiply those together, and that tells me there are about 250 million, 240 million iPhones purchased every single year. I think an iPhone costs about $800 these days. And with those two figures, I can estimate the total market size of about $192 billion. So none of these component parts were that complicated, right? It's basic multiplication, pretty round numbers, but it's a logical problem-solving framework that ends up with a number that feels okay, right? So that takes us to our last step, which is gut checking our answer. And this is a little bit tricky to do, but we ended up with 192 billion. It's a big number, right? It feels large, but we're talking about the flagship product from one of the most valuable companies in the world. So my numbers would also mean that on average, about 1 in every 7 people in the world uses an iPhone. Again, I think that seems okay. It's not 1 in a million people. You can also compare that number against global GDP of 80 trillion, which feels okay. It's about 1 to 2% of global GDP. The point is, even if I had no clue what the actual market is, which I don't, none of these figures seem wildly inaccurate. It doesn't seem like I'm off by orders of magnitude, and each of those individual assumptions that I made makes some sense and is defensible. And again, just taking a minute to talk about how you might validate and benchmark your answer is a huge win. It's a great way to showcase your critical thinking skills, and it's 10 times more important than how close you are to the actual answer at the end of the day. So the next thing I want to talk about is root cause analysis. I'm just going to intro this, and then I want to pause and do some Q&A. We go much deeper into root cause as part of the course. We do some good mock interviews in root cause as well. But again, this is about trying to identify the underlying cause of a specific incident or event. And here's an example here. Suppose the interviewer said, our site traffic increased 50% this month, but sales are flat. Why? Right? This is a very common question that someone like a marketing analyst might have to encounter in the real world on the job. So how would you start to diagnose and troubleshoot something like that? Well, you could ask questions like, let's reach out to the team for more context. Did we open a new traffic source? Were there new marketing efforts? Was there a big PR push? Then I'd try to understand, was it a sudden sharp change or a gradual increase? Can we break this data down by day or by hour? Then maybe I'd segment that data a few different ways to see if it's isolated to certain subsets of traffic, right? And then et cetera, et cetera. You're kind of adding the information that you need to eventually get down to the root cause behind what might be going on here. And I actually really like this type of question because it feels way more realistic and much closer to the actual job than something like a market sizing case. So be prepared to answer questions like this. Again, a little bit less common, but you do see these sometimes, especially for data analyst or BI roles. So I'll wrap quickly with just the key takeaways. Remember those qualities that employers are looking for. Be confident, stay calm, come across as someone who people would love to work with. Treat the interview as a two-way dialogue, not a test. You're evaluating them as much as they're evaluating you. Write down and rehearse answers to common questions. Have those thoughtful answers prepared in advance. It's going to help you look confident and polished. Use those resources that I shared with you. And then finally, take time to learn these common frameworks for solving things like market sizing and root cause cases. Don't wing it. Apply those frameworks and practice applying them to a wide variety of cases, especially if you anticipate getting one of these questions in an interview. So that's what I've got for you today. I hope that was helpful. Stop sharing, and hopefully we can take, it's like we've got 5 or 7 minutes here for some Q&A.
Yeah, amazing job. As expected, Chris. Can't believe you're sick and you're doing this and you're delivering so much value. Just the chat as you're going through was really resonating with people. So pretty awesome. So yeah, let's do some Q&A. Hey there, hope you're enjoying the video. Sorry to interrupt, we'll get you right back to it. Right now, Maven Analytics is offering a deal that was just too big not to share it with you. We've got an early Black Friday sale, and you can save up to 50% off of Maven Analytics paid plans. So if you've been considering learning Excel, SQL, Power BI, Python, Tableau, and everything else that you need to become a data analyst or accelerate your career, now is the perfect time. Check it out at mavenanalytics.io. You can see the Black Friday offer in the banner at the top of the screen. You can't miss it. Again, if you're on the fence, there's never been a better time. We don't do a lot of these sales, so I hope that some people will take advantage. Now, enjoy the video. I'll let you get back to it. Thanks. So how about we'll go with Albert's question. He gave us an hour before this, so he earns first question. What general advice at the end, they usually say, do you have any questions for us? Do you always ask a question? What do you think, Chris?
I think you should always have a couple of good questions in your back pocket. The worst thing you can do is just say no and have some awkward silence. I think for me, the types of questions that I'm going to ask are the ones that have a really big impact on how good of a fit I am for the role and how much I'm actually going to enjoy that role. So things that I really want to understand are things like company culture. What would other people in this role or in surrounding roles, what would they say about the culture here? What values are really important to you as a business in terms of how you build a culture and treat your employees? I also really like asking, what are your expectations for this role, or how would you measure what success looks like in this role at the 30-day mark, the 60-day mark, the 90-day mark, that really just helps understand, like, are you setting yourself up for failure, or are the expectations realistic and something that you think are fair and that you can pay off? Those are probably my two go-to questions that I would certainly ask.
Yeah. And I think in general, the framework should be, think about questions that make you seem thoughtful, not the other way, right? Like I gave the example in the chat of the person who said, hey, what do you guys sell at Vistaprint? When I was working at Vistaprint, I'm like, this is a public company. It's very easy to get that information. Like that, they see with that question, they seemed not thoughtful, versus Chris's questions, you seem thoughtful, like you're really, that's what you want to put out there. So let's see. We've got, oh man, there's so many good questions here.
I've got a quick one. Any
Awesome.
resources for practicing case study questions? There was a book that I read that was super helpful. I think it's still up to date. It's called Case in Point by Mark Cosentino. And I think you can find it on Amazon. And that was exactly where I learned these frameworks to solve market sizing cases. And I studied that book. And in my interview for a marketing analyst role, starting my career, I applied that framework, nailed the interview, got the job, and it was thanks to that book. So definitely check it out.
That's awesome. This is a good question, or I can't close that, Chris.
Oh, I'm done answering. Sorry.
Is it common to be asked about the expected salary, and what would you say if they ask you that?
About the expected, yeah, this is a tricky one. I've seen a bunch of people kind of posting perspectives on this in the past, because what you don't want to do is provide a specific number, right? Mm-hmm. Because when you provide a specific number, either you run the risk of either saying a number that's so high that it turns them off because it's out of their expected range, or so low that you lowball them yourself and miss out on potential income that they would have paid you if they didn't have that information. I think keeping it general and talking about a range of values that you feel is fair and appropriate for that role and for your level of experience, that's how I would answer it. I'm curious to hear, your perspective, John, or anyone else on how they would answer it, but that's my perspective.
I totally agree. And I think the thing that you nailed is, like, don't just come with a number that you're thinking, right? Because it's very rare that that's going to be a good situation that you've created, right? Another strategy you can say is like, hey, I've researched the role. It looks like this is the rough range. I think that's an acceptable range. That's sort of what I'm looking for. I would say keep it fairly broad, keep it, maybe pad the high end, depending how desperate you are or how opportunistic and strong you're feeling. You might want to pad it on the high end. The other thing is, I would say, I always think of trying to delay the salary question as late as possible in the job. And there's some downsides to that, but the downside being maybe you waste your time if, like, the salary range is too low for you or something. But I think the upside is, let's say the salary range was too low for you, but then you go through the interview and they fall in love with you, and then they can't picture anyone else in this role. They're like, we've interviewed 4 people, like, she was the best by far. I want her on my team. Then maybe a conversation happens that's like, let's talk about a 20% increase in this comp because we think she's that much better than the competition, and we think it's worth it. And that definitely does happen, but that would not happen at the screening stage. At the screening stage, she'd be wiped out because, we can't afford her. So I'd say, for me, I always try to do it after they fall in love, and then you get some flexibility.
I'll take one more here. So we talked about problem-solving ability, which is kind of this, like, fuzzy thing that's much more difficult to pin down than something like hone your SQL skills or your Excel skills, right? So how do you strengthen general problem-solving ability, especially when you don't have practical on-the-job experience, which is where most people build that problem-solving skill set? One tip that I have that was also very helpful for me, I think it's like Harvard Business Review or Harvard Business School. They publish free case studies online. I think I share a link inside the course that hopefully is still active, but it's like real life business cases that break down actual complicated problems that real big companies are facing and how different solutions were proposed and executed. And it's a really nice way to just at least start to see the language that people use around, solving these problems and these techniques for breaking down big problems into smaller component parts. So that would be a great place to look if you want to really hone that skill.
Yeah, that's another good way to tackle. People ask, like, how do I hone my business acumen in general? That's the same thing. It's like reading some of those HBS cases is great. Here's another one from Candace. It says, is there a percentage of the job description that you would recommend that you meet before applying? For example, is it 60% of the job description? I think it's definitely not 100% because, like we talked about, these job descriptions are wish lists. They look at all the people that are internal. Most of the employees that they've already hired would not check this box. Probably none of, check all the boxes. Probably no one would, right? So like, don't think of it that way that you have to be 100. It's absolutely not that. But I would think of it, there's kind of two ways I like to think about this. And I think they both align. One is you should think about, what do you think is the most important part of the role? They put 20 things in the job description. See if you can try to tease out, like, is it really one or two things that's you're going to primarily be doing with yourself, which is almost always the case. There's probably one or two skills that you're leaning on. So figure that out. Sometimes talking to the hiring manager, talking to somebody else in the company, like, is this a Tableau shop? Okay, cool. Then Tableau is probably pretty important, right? The other piece is I really like if you can get a role where sort of half of the role and you're really good at it, but then the other part of it you don't know yet and you're going to have to grow into it. To me, that's a really good formula for making everybody happy, because the employer gets your 50% that you're really good at, so they're going to get value out of you, and then you are going to get to learn that other half of it on the job. So like, I don't know if 50-50 is really the perfect ratio, but to me, that seems like a decent starting point to give yourself some value that you can create right off the bat and look good, and also some area to grow too. So
I just realized I've got to drop. I've got a hard stop, but thank you guys so much. I love this topic. I love this presentation. Please dive into the course to go deeper. Please reach out, connect with me personally if there's anything that you didn't get answered here. But awesome session. Thank you guys so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. And yeah, thanks everybody in the audience. Cheers.
Cheers.
Hey there, I hope you enjoyed this video. This was part of our open campus event where we ran 24 sessions in front of a live audience over the course of 2 weeks. It was a ton of fun. We did all these live sessions and we opened up our entire learning platform for free. You did not need a paid account to take advantage of all the courses. So folks could learn Excel, SQL, Power BI, Tableau, Python, etc. All the stuff that you need to learn data analysis skills and take your career to the next level. If you missed it this year, keep an eye out. We'll definitely be doing this again next year, probably again in October. We would love to see you there. And the last thing that I'll leave you with, if you're looking to take your skills to the next level right now and you've been on the fence about a Maven Analytics paid plan, we are currently running our early Black Friday sale. This is the absolute best time to pay for Maven Analytics if you want to, so don't miss out. You'll have the opportunity to save up to 50% on paid plans, which is a pretty great opportunity. You can check out all the details at mavenanalytics.io. Just look for the early Black Friday banner at the top of the site. You can't miss it. Hope that we'll see some of you there as well. Thanks for watching.